I represented myself in court because my wife made sure I couldn't afford anyone else. She laughed when I stood up. Not a nervous laugh. A confident one. The kind rich people use when they're about to erase you. "You're too poor to hire a lawyer," she said loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. And the worst part, they agreed. I saw it in their eyes, in the way the judge sighed, and the way her attorney smiled like this was already over. My hands were shaking, but not because I was unprepared, because I knew what I was about to do would either save me or ruin me for good. I took one breath, looked straight at her, and spoke my first sentence. That's when the room froze. Not because I begged, not because I cried, because I named the one thing she swore would never be spoken out loud. And in that silence, I realized something terrifying. They weren't laughing at me anymore. They were afraid. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far a story like this can reach. Sometimes knowing someone is there makes all the difference. Thank you. And now, here's my story. Also, if you've ever been underestimated, cornered, or made to feel small, please subscribe. Not for me, for the next person who needs to hear that you can come back from rock bottom. My name is Zane Rourke, and this is how I went from being the punchline in a courtroom to the reason my wife stopped smiling. The moment I pushed through the heavy doors of Courtroom 5E in Fulton County, Atlanta, I could feel the air already decided against me. You can hear it in a room before anyone speaks. It's in the soft shuffle of expensive shoes, in the bored rustle of paper, and the way people look up and then look away like you're not worth their time. My name is Zane Rourke. I'm 33 years old, and that morning I was representing myself in my own divorce trial, pro se, alone, exactly the way my wife wanted it. I didn't come dressed like a man about to win. I came dressed like a man they could underestimate without guilt. A worn charcoal suit that didn't quite fit the way it used to, a tie I'd owned since before my marriage, and a thin, beat-up briefcase that looked like it had survived more layoffs than board meetings. I kept my head down as I walked to my table. I made a point of moving slowly, like the weight of the moment was pressing my shoulders toward the floor. On the table in front of me sat one yellow legal pad and a plastic cup of room-temperature water. That was it. No laptop, no binders, no paralegals, no legal army whispering in my ear. Just paper water and the version of me they'd already written the ending for. Across the aisle sat Callista Hallow, my wife, like she was watching an awards show she knew she'd win. Callista wasn't just wealthy. She was the kind of wealthy that comes with a private elevator and a PR team that can make a scandal disappear before it hits the noon news. She was the CEO of Hallow Freight Systems, one of the biggest logistics and shipping operations in the region. Midtown Atlanta's glass towers wore her name like a perfume. She didn't glance around the courtroom like a normal person. She owned the space without needing to say it out loud. Her table looked like a war room. 2 paralegals with sleek laptops, stacks of neatly bound exhibits, color-coded tabs, a pitcher of cold water with actual glass cups. Small details meant to signal who mattered and who didn't. And at the center of it all sat Dashiell Crowe, her attorney. In legal circles, his reputation was a warning label. He wasn't known for winning with brilliance. He was known for winning by leaving the other side with nothing left to stand on. Not money, not dignity, not even a clean story to tell afterward. People said Dashiell didn't just defeat opponents, he dismantled them. The courtroom had a quiet collective confidence that I was about to be dismantled. Callista leaned back, crossed her legs, and laughed when she saw me. Not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh. A real one, sharp, satisfied, and aimed. "You're too poor to hire a lawyer," she said loud enough to bounce off the wood paneling and land in the laps of strangers. A couple people in the gallery snickered. I heard the small, ugly sound of agreement travel through the room like a ripple. The kind of agreement that isn't spoken because it doesn't need to be. It's written all over faces. That laugh wasn't just humiliation, it was a signal flare. A reminder to her side that she'd cut me off clean months ago. The joint accounts locked. The credit cards we used for everything canceled. The emergency fund I thought existed moved somewhere I couldn't touch. Every single door that might have led me to a lawyer had been quietly welded shut, and she wanted the room to see it. She wanted the judge to see it. She wanted me to feel it. Judge Orson Pike entered with the weight of someone who'd seen too many people destroy each other and stopped being surprised by cruelty. He was old-school stern and allergic to theatrics. The kind of judge who didn't care how pretty your pain was. He cared whether you wasted his time. He scanned the docket, his expression already tired, then looked up and took in the scene: Callista's polished legal machine on one side, and me with my yellow pad on the other. When the clerk called the case, Dashiell stood as if he'd practiced the movement in a mirror. "Dashiell Crowe for the respondent, Ms. Callista Hallow," he said smoothly. His voice belonged in a commercial for power and certainty. The judge's eyes shifted to me, and for the petitioner I stood. The scrape of my chair against the floor sounded louder than it should have, like the room was holding its breath just to hear whether I would stumble. Zane Rourke. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice steady on purpose. "I'm representing myself." Judge Pike's face tightened in that familiar expression, disappointment disguised as patience. He exhaled slowly through his nose, then leaned forward just enough to make the warning land. "Mr. Rourke, I'm going to ask you this once. Your wife is the CEO of a major corporation. There are significant marital assets at issue here: equity trusts, real estate, and potentially complex financial instruments. Ms. Hallow's counsel has decades of experience. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed without representation?" I didn't look at Callista when he said it. I kept my eyes on the bench. "I can't afford counsel, Your Honor." Dashiell didn't even wait. He rose again as if my words were an inconvenience that needed correction. "For the record, Your Honor, Ms. Hallow did not prevent Mr. Rourke from retaining counsel. She simply secured the marital accounts to prevent irresponsible spending during separation. We offered him a generous settlement of $35,000 to assist with his transition. He refused. The word transition sounded like a polite way to say disappearance. Judge Pike's brow lifted slightly. 35,000, he repeated like he was testing the weight of it. Dashiell smiled as if he'd rehearsed that moment too. "More than Mr. Rourke brought into the marriage, Your Honor. He had limited financial literacy when they met. Ms. Hallow's intent has been to protect the company and the workforce from disruption." Callista's mouth curled at the edges barely, like she enjoyed hearing my life reduced to a number that sounded small in a room full of money. The judge looked at me again. "Mr. Rourke, if you proceed, you will be held to the same standards as an attorney. I will not guide you. If you fail to object, evidence comes in. If you fail to ask the right questions, you lose. Do you understand?" I nodded once slow. "Yes, Your Honor." Inside, my heartbeat was loud enough to shake my ribs, not because I was scared of talking, because I was standing at the edge of a cliff I'd been walking toward for months, and I knew there was no turning back. This was the part where people thought the story ended with me signing something I didn't understand, taking a check, and leaving the city like I'd never existed. That's what Callista bought and paid for, not the divorce, the erasure. But I didn't come to beg for mercy. I didn't come to argue about who worked harder or who sacrificed more or whether a marriage is a partnership. Those were distractions. The truth was heavier than that, and it had a paper trail. So I stayed quiet. I let Callista's laugh hang in the air. I let Dashiell talk. I let the judge believe I was a risk to his schedule. I let the courtroom settle into the comfort of thinking it understood me. Because what I needed wasn't sympathy. What I needed was complacency. And as I sat back down, hands folded neatly over that yellow legal pad, I thought about the one detail no one in that room knew. The detail that made my thin briefcase feel heavier than Callista's entire stack of binders. Callista had spent months sealing me out of everything she could: accounts, contacts, access, even my own story. But she'd made one mistake, and it wasn't a mistake the kind of person like her was used to making. She'd built her life on control. Then she'd gotten careless with convenience, a family data sync, a shared home network she insisted on because she liked everything in one place: photos, documents, receipts, calendars, backups. She thought it was harmless, a luxury, something beneath her to worry about. She never imagined it would become a crack big enough for the truth to seep through. I didn't tell anyone that. Not yet. I only reminded myself as the bailiff called the next item on the docket and Dashiell prepared to speak that I wasn't here to ask for my half. I was here to make sure the truth showed up on the record in a courtroom where lies have consequences. Dashiell Crowe began the way men like him always begin, by deciding who I was out loud before I got the chance to define myself. He didn't need to shout. His confidence did the shouting for him. He stepped into the center aisle like it was a stage and he'd been invited to perform. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm and polished. "This case is simple. Ms. Hallow built Hallow Freight Systems from the ground up. She took the risk. She carried the debt. She worked the hours. She created jobs. Mr. Rourke, while respected as a spouse, made no measurable contribution to the enterprise beyond the domestic sphere." I could feel his eyes flick toward me, then away, as if I weren't worth direct contact. "He now seeks to leverage the dissolution of the marriage into an unwarranted claim on corporate equity and restricted assets. We intend to show that he lacks the expertise to interpret corporate financials, and that his allegations are emotional in nature, unsupported, inconsistent, and frankly unreliable." Unreliable. He let the words settle like dust. Then he leaned into the one thing more dangerous than money credibility. "Your Honor, this court has already received indications that Mr. Rourke has in the past struggled with emotional stability. We believe his current conduct reflects that pattern. The respondent asks the court to adopt the proposed settlement and bring this matter to a swift, fair conclusion." He sat down as if he'd just closed a book he'd already finished reading. Callista didn't clap, but she might as well have. She angled her head toward me, eyes bright with that same cruel certainty as earlier. When the judge looked at her, she layered in the performance, soft voice measured sadness, the kind people confuse for sincerity. "I didn't want it to come to this, Your Honor," she said. "I just want to move forward. I offered him enough to start over. He refuses because he wants to punish me." Then, because she couldn't resist, she turned the knife again. "And honestly, he's too poor to hire a lawyer, so I don't even understand what he thinks he's doing." There it was. The bait. The invitation to react. To get angry. To sound bitter. To confirm Dashiell's story that I was emotional and unstable. Judge Pike's gaze moved to me. "Mr. Rourke," he said, tone clipped. "Your opening. Keep it brief." I stood up and I didn't go to the podium. I didn't want the distance. I wanted the room to feel how close the truth was about to get. I stepped into the aisle with my legal pad held against my chest like a shield, not because I needed it, but because it made me look exactly like what they expected a man about to lose. I started with something simple. "My wife says this is simple," I said. My voice was steady, almost quiet. "She says she built everything alone and I'm just noise." Callista's mouth tightened just slightly, like she was already bored. I kept going and I refused to play the game they handed me. I didn't talk about love. I didn't talk about sacrifice. I didn't list the nights I waited up, the jobs I turned down, the years I swallowed my pride to support her image. None of that mattered in a courtroom that worshipped paper. So I gave them paper. "The law requires complete disclosure," I said, looking at the judge. "And what's been filed in this case isn't complete." Dashiell's pen paused mid-tap. I let the room be quiet for a beat, then delivered my first real sentence like a match to gasoline. "There's a trust called the Larkspur Trust," I said, pronouncing it clearly. "Structured as an irrevocable vehicle with layered beneficiaries. And based on the records I have, it holds approximately $47 million. It does not appear anywhere in Ms. Hallow's disclosures." For half a second, no one moved. It wasn't dramatic like a movie. It was sharper than that. The kind of silence that happens when a room realizes it has been wrong about the person it was laughing at. Judge Pike leaned forward, his earlier annoyance replaced by something colder and more precise. "Mr. Rourke," he said slowly, "that's a serious allegation." I nodded once. "I know, Your Honor." Dashiell stood so fast, his chair legs whispered against the floor. "Your Honor, this is exactly what I warned the court about," he said, voice tight around the edges now. My client has no such trust. Mr. Rourke is speculating based on information he does not understand. We object to this line of "Sit down, Judge Pike" cut in. Not loudly, just firmly. Then he looked back at me. Mr. Rourke alleging hidden assets without proof is a fast way to lose credibility in this courtroom, and potentially a fast way to pay the other side's fees. Do you have proof I didn't reach for a stack? I didn't flood the court with chaos. I reached into my thin briefcase and pulled out one page already marked "already clean." Minimal. Enough to open the door. Yes, I said. I handed it to the bailiff. I'd like this marked as Exhibit 1. The bailiff carried it across. Dashiell took the copy like it might burn him. His eyes scanned the page and I watched the muscles in his jaw tighten as he realized it wasn't a random printout. It was a wire transfer confirmation data mount routing identifiers showing a multi-million-dollar movement into an account that didn't belong in a divorce disclosure. Dashiell looked up just once, and for the first time his expression wasn't smug. It was calculating in a different way, like he was remeasuring the room. Callista didn't speak. She didn't need to. But the way her fingers tightened around the edge of her binder told me she understood the same thing he did, that Paige couldn't exist if I was the man they'd been mocking. Not unless I'd gotten access to something real. Judge Pike took his own copy, scanned it, and the temperature in his voice changed. "Mr. Crow," he said, eyes still on the paper. "You'll respond to this." Dashiell cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have not authenticated this document. There are multiple ways to save it," the judge said. Then he looked at me again. "Mr. Rourke, continue." I felt the room pivot. Not toward me, exactly toward the possibility that the story they'd agreed on was wrong. That's the thing about power, it stays confident until it senses paperwork. I didn't press harder yet. I didn't expose everything. Not because I couldn't, but because I understood something Dashiell didn't think a poor husband would understand: timing is a weapon. If I dumped every exhibit on the record at once, he'd bury me in objections, procedural fights, and side arguments about admissibility. He'd turn my evidence into noise, so I did the opposite. I made my case with one clean cut and let the bleeding show. As I stood there, I could feel Callista trying to solve the puzzle in real time. Her eyes kept flicking not to the paper but to me, like she was hunting for the crack in my composure that would explain how I pulled this off. She couldn't picture me hiring investigators or paying for forensic accounting. She couldn't picture me outsmarting her security, which meant in her mind there were only two options left. Either I was lying, or I'd hacked her. And that's when I realized what Dashiell was going to do next before he did it. He wasn't going to argue the existence of the trust first. He was going to attack the path the evidence took to get into my hands. He was going to poison the well, paint me as an intruder, an illegal actor, a man desperate enough to break laws because he couldn't win fairly. Because if he could convince the judge I obtained the records improperly, he wouldn't have to disprove what the records showed. He'd just have to get them thrown out. It was the oldest trick in a courtroom: don't fight the truth, disqualify the messenger. And the irony, the twist that made my mouth almost want to smile, was that the truth hadn't come from hacking or stalking or hiring anyone. It came from a hole Callista herself had carved into her own walls. A convenience she loved, a shared sink she insisted on, a family system that treated everything like it belonged in one place. I wasn't ready to reveal that crack yet. Not until it mattered. Not until the wrong accusation forced it into the light. So I stayed calm. I let Dashiell reset in his chair, already plotting his next angle. I let Callista wear her frozen expression like armor, and I kept my face neutral as the judge instructed the court to proceed. Because I could feel it now, the moment of complacency slipping away from them. The moment the room stopped seeing me as a punchline and started seeing me as a threat. And I knew exactly what they were going to do in response. They were going to come for my credibility next. They were going to try to make the judge hate me, and I was going to let them try. By the time Judge Pike told the court to proceed, the laughter from earlier had gone thin. It wasn't gone completely. Atlanta has plenty of people who enjoy watching someone fall, but it had quieted into something sharper, more cautious. Dashiell Crow didn't look rattled so much as recalibrated. He'd learned in real time that I wasn't going to sob into a settlement. So he did what predators do when the first bite doesn't kill. He sent in a witness to make the room feel safe again. "I call Wesley Sutter," Daschle announced. Wesley Sutter was the CFO of Hallow Freight Systems, and he walked to the stand like he belonged there. Tailored suit, clean cuffs, a wedding ring that glinted when he raised his hand to take the oath. He had the kind of face companies loved putting on investor calls, steady, reassuring, a man who could say everything is fine while the building burned behind him. Daschle approached like they were old friends. "Mr. Sutter, you oversee the finances of Hallow Freight Systems, correct?" "Yes," Wesley said, voice calm. "And in that role, you're familiar with the company's accounting practices, audits, and financial disclosures." "I am." Daschle paced a step, letting the juryless courtroom absorb the performance. "Have you ever heard of the so-called Larkspur Trust?" Mr. Rourke referenced. Wesley didn't even blink. "No." "Have you ever directed company funds into hidden accounts for the purpose of concealing assets from this court?" "No." "Is it your testimony under oath that Hallow Freight Systems books are audited, compliant, and above board?" "Yes," Wesley said, steady as a metronome. "Our books are audited annually. All transfers are operational. Vendor payments, expansion costs, consulting, logistics, infrastructure, standard business." Daschle turned slightly toward the bench as if presenting a solved equation. "Thank you. No further questions." The message was clear. I was confusing adult money with my own bruised ego. A bitter husband grabbing for conspiracy because he couldn't handle being left behind. Judge Pike looked at me. Mr. Rourke. Cross. I stood and I left my yellow pad on the table. I didn't want to look like I was reading. I wanted to look like I was remembering. I walked toward the witness stand slowly, the way you walk toward someone you've known long enough to know where the lies sit in their throat. Wesley's eyes flicked to mine, and in that half-second I saw recognition tighten his jaw. We weren't strangers. That mattered. "Good morning, Wesley," I said. He swallowed once. "Mr. Rourke." I kept my voice even. "How long have we known each other?" Daschle rose instantly. "Objection. Relevance." Judge Pike didn't even glance at him. "Overruled. Answer." Wesley cleared his throat. "About 9 years. And you've been in my home?" I continued, not raising my voice more than once. Wesley hesitated. "Yes. You've eaten dinner at my table," I said, watching his hands. "My cooking, my wife's cooking. You've sat across from me and talked about the company like it was a family." Daschle shifted, annoyed. "Your Honor, Mr. Crow," the judge warned, and Daschle sat back down. I nodded once like I was just building a timeline. "So you know I'm not a man who throws names around in court because I'm emotional." Wesley's nostrils flared slightly. "I'm not here to comment on your motivations." "No," I said. "You're here to tell this court the books are clean." I took one step closer. "Wesley, do you remember the corporate retreat in Asheville?" A small twitch hit the corner of his eye. "I attend many retreats. This one was at the Grove Park Inn," I said calmly. 2 winters ago. The company rented out half a floor. There was a ski trip the next morning." Daschle leaned forward, interest sharpening. Wesley's voice tightened a fraction. "I remember." "Do you remember leaving your laptop with me?" I asked, "because you didn't trust the hotel safe and you didn't want to carry it down to the bar." Daschle sprang up again. "Objection. Speculation and improper foundation." "I can lay foundation," I said without looking at him. Judge Pike held up a hand. "Mr. Rourke, keep it focused. Mr. Sutter, answer the question." Wesley's mouth opened, then closed. He tried for smooth. "I may have." "You did," I said quietly enough that it didn't sound like an attack. "You were drinking. You told me the password because you forgot it twice in front of me." Wesley's gaze snapped up. His throat worked. Daschle's voice turned sharp. "Your Honor, this is..." "Sit down, Mr. Crow," Judge Pike said, irritation finally aimed in the right direction. I held Wesley's eyes. "You told me it was your daughter's birthday." Wesley's cheeks tightened. "I don't recall saying that." "You don't have to recall," I said. "You just have to answer the next question." I let a beat pass. Does Hallow Freight Systems use an internal accounting system called Black Rail Ledger? The temperature in the room shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of shift you feel when people stop leaning back and start leaning forward. Wesley's mouth went dry. We use multiple tools. Answer yes or no, Judge Pike ordered. You're under oath. Wesley's eyes darted to Dashiell, then back. We have internal software, yes. Black Rail Ledger, I repeated calm. And Black Rail has a feature that maintains 2 sets of records correct. Dashiell stood face hard. Objection. Mischaracterizes proprietary software. I turned my head slightly, still not looking at him fully. It's not mischaracterization, if the documentation says it. Judge Pike's gaze narrowed. Mr. Sutter, answer. Wesley's fingers clenched on the armrest. It's capable of generating different reporting views. Different reporting views, I echoed like I was tasting the euphemism. One for auditors, one for internal leadership. Wesley swallowed. That's one way to describe it. Here's another, I said. 2 books. Wesley's eyes flashed with panic, and it was quick, but it was real. He knew exactly what I was saying in a room that didn't tolerate guessing. I stepped back toward my table just enough to pick up a folder from my briefcase. 1 folder, not a stack. I walked it back to the bailiff. I'd like to submit another exhibit, I said. Dashiell's voice rose. Your Honor, we object to any further exhibits without proper authentication. You'll have your opportunity, Judge Pike cut in. Bailiff Market. Wesley watched the bailiff place the document on the projector. The screen lit up with a clean, official-looking filing articles of incorporation, a registered agent, a Nevada address that meant nothing on its own. Then the name. Nova Kit. A murmur spread through the gallery like a match catching. Nova Kit was Callista's assistant, 24. The one who showed up at company events in dresses that didn't match the occasion and smiled too brightly at Callista's jokes. The one employees whispered about in break rooms, the one whose promotion path didn't make sense unless you understood what favor looks like in corporate life. I didn't even look at Callista yet. I looked at Wesley. On December 17th, I said, voice steady, 3 days before my wife filed for divorce, did you oversee a payment labeled consulting fees to Orion Ridge? Consulting. Wesley's lips parted. I'd have to review the ledger. You reviewed it, I said. You approved it. Dashiell was on his feet again. Objection. Argumentative. Judge Pike's jaw clenched. Mr. Sutter. Answer. Wesley's voice cracked on the first try. He recovered, but the crack stayed. I processed payments as directed by executive leadership. Executive leadership, I repeated. You mean Callista? Wesley's eyes flicked and he tried to hold the line. I'm saying I follow executive authorization. And who owns Orion Ridge Consulting? I asked. Wesley's mouth tightened. I don't know. You do, I said, and I let the words stay simple. It's on the screen. The courtroom wasn't watching me anymore. They were watching Callista. They were watching Dashiell. They were watching Wesley Sutter's composure crack under the weight of a name that shouldn't have been there. Callista sat perfectly still, but her throat worked as if she was swallowing something bitter. Dashiell's eyes were on the document, calculating angles, thinking about objections, thinking about damage control. And Wesley looked like a man realizing he'd walked into a room where the truth had already been placed on the table. I kept my gaze on him. Wesley, you've known me for years. You've sat in my house. You've asked me for favors. I've done favors for you. His jaw flexed. So I'm going to ask you one more time, I said. Is your testimony that you have never heard of hidden accounts and you have never seen executive leadership move money off the books? Wesley inhaled to answer, and for a split second the truth broke through his fear. Callista told me. Dashiell barked. Wesley jerked like he'd been snapped by a leash. I mean, he corrected himself fast. I've never been instructed to conceal assets from this court. But the damage was done. Not because the sentence finished. Because it started. Judge Pike's eyes narrowed into something dangerous. Mr. Sutter, he said, voice low. You will answer questions directly. If you attempt to evade, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Wesley nodded, sweat beading at his hairline. I stepped back, not pressing further. I didn't need to. I'd gotten what I came for that day. The room now understood this wasn't a wounded husband flailing. This was a record. No further questions, I said, and returned to my table. Dashiell rose, immediately moving, like he needed to reclaim the narrative before it slipped away completely. Your Honor, he said. Too controlled, we request the court limit further inquiry into corporate matters pending an evidentiary hearing. There are serious concerns about how Mr. Rourke obtained these documents, and we believe his conduct raises questions about his judgment and stability. I looked down at my legal pad as if I was writing something, but I wasn't. I was listening. Because I recognized the pivot. He wasn't trying to win on the numbers anymore, he was trying to win by making me the problem. Judge Pike's gaze shifted to me. We'll address that, he said. The court recessed not long after. As the room emptied, I felt eyes on my back, different eyes than the ones that laughed on day one. These were cautious, curious, some even unsettled. Callista walked past me without speaking. Her perfume hit the air like a memory of a marriage that had already died. Dashiell followed close to her shoulder, murmuring something into her ear that looked like strategy and sounded like warning. I gathered my legal pad, my thin briefcase, and my cup of water. My hands were steady, but my stomach wasn't, because I knew what came next. If they couldn't beat the evidence, they'd attack the man holding it. And I knew exactly what weapon they planned to use. When I walked back into the courthouse the next morning, the hallway felt quieter, like news had traveled without anyone admitting it. People who'd laughed before didn't laugh now. They watched. Some stared too long and then looked away when I met their eyes. The energy wasn't friendly. It was wary. Like the room had learned I wasn't safe to dismiss. I wore the same kind of simple suit, same thin briefcase, same legal pad. I didn't upgrade my appearance because I didn't need to. If anything, the contrast helped. It made it harder for anyone to explain away what was happening as some polished legal trick. I looked like a guy who shouldn't have power, and that made the power I carried more unsettling. Callista was already seated when I entered, posture straight, expression sealed. No public laughter today, no theatrical pity. She'd brought a different face, calm, cold, almost bored. The kind of calm people practice when they believe a single move will end the game. Dashiell stood as the judge took the bench. Your Honor, he began. Before we continue with these financial allegations, we move to limit the scope of inquiry. Mr. Rourke has attempted to turn this dissolution into a corporate investigation. It's a diversion. More importantly, it's founded on information he has no expertise to interpret. Judge Pike's eyes narrowed. Mr. Crow, you may argue relevance, but the court will decide what's relevant. Dashiell nodded as if he'd expected that. Understood. Which is why we also move to address Mr. Rourke's competence and credibility as a witness. The word competence landed like a door locking. He held up a document. The respondent submits a sworn statement from Dr. Marin Quill. I didn't flinch, but something in my chest tightened anyway. Not because I wasn't prepared. Because no matter how much you brace yourself, it still hurts to watch someone turn your worst season into a weapon. Dashiell approached the bench, offered the document, then turned toward the room with that practiced tone of concern that always sounds believable if you don't know the speaker. Your Honor, Dr. Quill treated Mr. Rourke following a traumatic family event. The statement reflects a documented history of paranoid ideation, emotional instability, and inpatient care. Callista's voice softened right on cue. I didn't want to bring this up, she said quietly, looking down like a grieving widow instead of the woman who'd laughed at me 2 days ago. But he's been unwell. I tried to help him. I tried to keep things private. And now he's standing here accusing people of conspiracies and hidden money, and I'm scared he's spiraling again. Dashiell nodded, letting her words do the work. The court must consider whether Mr. Rourke is a reliable narrator of events, whether his interpretations of financial documents are rooted in fact or in fixation, and whether his methods of obtaining information suggest unlawful intrusion. There it was. The line they wanted to draw: unstable man breaks into data, invents stories, punishes successful wife. Judge Pike's expression stayed unreadable. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "you're going to take the stand." I walked to the witness box, sat, and placed my hands where everyone could see them. Palms down, controlled. I refused to give them shaking fingers to point at. The bailiff administered the oath, and Dashiell stepped forward like he'd been waiting for this moment since the first laugh. "Mr. Rourke," he began, voice gentle in a way that made my skin crawl, "you were hospitalized after the loss of your child." "Correct, yes," I said. I didn't decorate the answer. "And you were prescribed medication for your condition." "Yes." "And during that time you told multiple people you believed your wife was manipulating you." I said I felt controlled. I answered carefully. I said I was being isolated. Dashiell tilted his head. "So you believed she was against you?" "I believed I was being pressured," I said. "There's a difference." He smiled like he'd caught me. "Were you diagnosed with paranoid ideation, Mr. Rourke?" I took a breath. The room was listening harder than it had listened to any bank record. Because people love numbers until they get bored. They never get bored of a broken person. "I was treated for depression and insomnia after a traumatic loss," I said, keeping my tone even. "I sought help because I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I didn't want to become someone I didn't recognize. That's what responsible adults do." Dashiell didn't let it land. "But you were admitted correct." "Yes. And now you're standing in court without counsel, making allegations involving offshore accounts, internal accounting systems, and trusts worth tens of millions of dollars." "Yes." He spread his hands slightly as if the conclusion was obvious. "Do you understand how that looks?" I looked past him to the judge. "It looks like someone finally stopped being afraid." Dashiell's smile tightened. "Or it looks like someone fixated on a narrative. Someone who can't let go. Someone who needs to believe there's a grand scheme because the simpler truth is too painful." Callista lowered her gaze again, playing the role of the exhausted wife. I could almost hear the story they wanted the room to accept: poor husband, unstable mind; rich wife, desperate accusations. Dashiell leaned in, voice dropping to something intimate. "Tell this court, Mr. Rourke." "How many times did you visit Dr. Quill?" I answered. "What medications were you on?" I answered. "How many times did you tell friends or family you felt watched, controlled, or targeted?" I answered, careful each time not to let the answers become the story. He tried to corner me into either anger or collapse. If I snapped, he'd call it volatility. If I cried, he'd call it instability. If I stayed calm, he'd call it performance. So I did the one thing he didn't expect. I told the truth without giving him the ending he wanted. "Yes," I said when he asked about treatment. "I got help. And I'm glad I did. Because it taught me something important. When you're trapped in a situation where your reality is constantly questioned, you start doubting your own memory. You start wondering if you're the problem." Dashiell's eyes narrowed. He sensed danger, but didn't know where it was coming from. "And that's why I continued. I started documenting things." He scoffed lightly. "Documenting." "Recording," I said, clear. The word wasn't loud, but it hit the room like a bell. Dashiell's head turned a fraction toward Callista before he could stop himself. Just a quick check, like a pilot looking for engine lights. Callista's fingers tightened on her binder. Her knuckles whitened for a second before she forced them back into calm. Judge Pike's gaze sharpened. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "what do you mean by recording?" I kept my voice respectful. "Georgia is a one-party consent state, Your Honor. If I'm part of the conversation, I can record it. Over the last year of my marriage, I carried a small recorder. Not to create drama. Not to punish anyone. I did it because I realized that if this ever went to court, my word would be treated like a problem to be managed." Dashiell recovered fast, but the recovery was too fast, too eager. "Your Honor, any so-called recordings are highly suspect. They can be edited, manipulated, misrepresented. I'm not asking you to rule on them right now," I said, turning slightly to the judge. "I'm asking permission to submit the device as potential evidence so the court can decide the proper time and foundation." Judge Pike studied me for a long moment. The courtroom had gone quiet again, but not in the same way as when I named the trust. This quiet was heavier. It carried the discomfort of people realizing that whatever they thought was happening, something else was underneath it. Dashiell tried to regain control. "Mr. Rourke, isn't it true that recording your spouse is obsessive behavior? Isn't it true you did it because you couldn't let go of your suspicions?" I kept my eyes on the judge. "I did it because I didn't want anyone to be able to rewrite what happened to me." Callista's jaw flexed. Her mask held, but I could see the strain. Judge Pike finally spoke. "Mr. Rourke, he said you may submit the device to the clerk for review. The court will determine admissibility at the next session. Until then, it will not be played in open court." I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Dashiell looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Not because he suddenly respected procedure, because arguing too hard about the recordings would make it obvious he was afraid of what was on them. When I stepped down from the stand, the room felt different than it had when I walked in. Dashiell hadn't crushed me. Callista hadn't made me look unstable. If anything, their attempt had exposed something they didn't intend to expose, that they'd planned for me to have no proof, no voice, and no one to believe. Outside the courtroom, the hallway air felt colder. I handed the small storage device to the clerk the way the judge instructed, watched it disappear behind the counter like a sealed envelope. And for the first time that week, I allowed myself a breath that wasn't shallow. They wanted to turn me into a man no one could trust. They wanted the judge to see me as a liability. But the more they tried to paint me as unreliable, the clearer it became why I had needed evidence in the first place. And as I walked down the courthouse steps into the Atlanta sun, I already knew what the next day would bring. They'd lose ground on the finances if the recordings ever saw light, so they'd fight like hell to keep them buried. That was fine, because I wasn't asking for permission to be heard anymore. I was building a record they couldn't laugh off. By the time I walked back into courtroom 5E, the clerk already had my little storage device logged and sealed like it mattered. That alone changed the air. 2 days earlier, I was the guy with a yellow legal pad and a paper cup. Now I was the guy who'd forced the court to create a chain of custody. People act different when the paperwork says you're real. Callista sat perfectly composed at the defense table, but her stillness wasn't confidence anymore. It was restraint. Dashiell Crowe kept his face neutral, yet I could tell he'd spent the night building fences in his head, trying to predict where the next blow would land. Judge Orson Pike took the bench and didn't waste a second. "Before we continue," he said, "voice firm, this court will address the proposed audio evidence. Mr. Rourke has represented that these recordings may contain admissions related to concealed assets and interference with witness credibility. If the content suggests criminal conduct such as bribery, fraud, or coercion, the court will consider it under the appropriate exception. Mr. Crowe, you may be heard." Dashiell rose smooth as ever, but the ease was slightly forced. "Your Honor, marital communications are protected. Allowing private conversations into open court is a severe intrusion. Additionally, audio can be manipulated. We're in an era where technology can fabricate voices. The risk of prejudice is enormous." Judge Pike's eyes didn't soften. "Then give me more than fear and buzzwords," he said. "Specific objections. Specific foundation issues. If your position is that the audio is fabricated, you'll have the opportunity to request authentication procedures. But I'm not excluding evidence based on a vague suggestion that anything could be fake." Dashiell's jaw tightened. He nodded once. "Understood, Your Honor. At minimum, we object to playing anything publicly without first reviewing it." I stood before he could keep controlling the tempo. "Your Honor, may I lay foundation?" Judge Pike gestured. "Proceed." I kept it plain. No speeches, no anger. I started carrying a recorder after Ms. Hallow locked me out of the joint accounts, changed passwords on shared services, and cut off access to our financial records, I said. After that, she began saying directly that if I pushed back, she'd prove I was unstable. Not as a metaphor, as a plan. Callista's eyes flickered just once. "I'm not asking to play hours of personal conversations," I continued. I'm asking to play a segment that directly relates to undisclosed assets and to using medical paperwork to discredit me. I'm also asking to play it in open court because if we keep dancing around it, we'll burn a day arguing about it instead of facing it." Dashiell interrupted sharp. "Your Honor, this is exactly what Judge Pike cut him off with a single look. Mr. Crow, enough." He turned to me. "Mr. Rourke, you understand that if this contains evidence of criminal conduct, it changes more than this divorce." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "That's why I'm bringing it here." Judge Pike leaned back, expression hard. "I'm allowing it for the limited purpose of determining relevance under the exception for wrongdoing. If the recording suggests bribery, fraud, or threats designed to manipulate proceedings, the privilege you're hiding behind doesn't apply the way you want it to." Bailiff. The bailiff took the device from the clerk, walked it to the court system, and plugged it in. A simple media player popped onto the screen. The room went so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the AC in the vents. Callista sat upright, chin slightly raised, but her throat moved like she'd swallowed something sour. Dashiell didn't object again. He just stared at the defense table for half a second, like he was silently asking her why he hadn't been warned. "Play it," Judge Pike ordered. Static crackled, then her voice filled the room. Not a courtroom version of her voice. Not the soft, wounded tone she used for judges and cameras. This was the voice I knew from our kitchen late at night when she thought she didn't have to pretend. "You really think anyone's gonna believe you?" Callista's recorded voice said low and contemptuous. "You're broke. You're emotional. You've already got a file. All I have to do is pull one thread and you'll fall apart." My own recorded voice came through next, thinner, exhausted. "You're hiding money." Her laugh on the recording wasn't the same laugh she used in public. It was uglier. Money moves. That's what money does. Offshore, domestic, whatever. You don't touch it. You don't even get near it. Then the line that turned the judge's face from stern to dangerous. "And if you try," Callista said on the audio, "I'll have Dr. Quill write whatever I need. You want paranoid. You want manic. I can buy a label. I already did. People like you don't win court fights. They get declared incompetent. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I let the sound do what sound does. It bypasses arguments and goes straight into people's bones." The recording continued, and Callista's voice sharpened. "You think the trust is for you? That's adorable. That's not how this works. You go after it, I bury you. I'll make sure your lawyer never calls you back, and if you try to stand up in front of a judge, you'll look like a man having an episode." The clip ended with a soft click, and the silence afterward felt heavier than the audio itself. Even the court reporter's fingers paused like she needed a second to remember she was supposed to keep typing. Judge Pike took off his glasses, slowly cleaned them like his patience was being polished into a weapon, then put them back on. He looked directly at Dashiell. "Mr. Crow," he said, voice quiet, "did your client just admit to purchasing a medical diagnosis to influence legal credibility?" Dashiell stood pale around the edges. "Your Honor, we have not authenticated this. I have not heard this before. It could be edited. It could be fabricated. I didn't argue the whole world. I argued the details that couldn't be guessed by someone outside our home." "Your Honor," I said, stepping forward. "The recording was made in our master bathroom. You can hear the echo, the tile, the high ceiling. There's also a line right before this segment that references the brass sailboat soap dish on the counter. That's not something a stranger would know, and it's not something you'd pull from a financial file." Judge Pike held his gaze on me. "Noted," he said. "Mr. Crow, if you want a forensic review file, the appropriate motion. But at this moment, I'm treating this as relevant and deeply concerning." Callista finally spoke, voice sharp. "That's taken out of context." Judge Pike's head snapped toward her. "You will not speak out of turn," he warned. "If you do it again, you will be sanctioned." Callista's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes were no longer calm. They were calculating, angry, and for the first time uncertain. I inhaled once, and made the next move as simply as possible. "Your Honor," I said, "I also have a witness present to address the affidavit submitted by Dr. Marin Quill." Dashiell's head lifted so fast it looked like it hurt. Your Honor, Judge Pike raised a hand. Who is the witness, Mr. Rourke? I turned toward the back of the courtroom. Dr. Marin Quill. The doors opened and she walked in like someone who hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back too tight, her face washed out, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked less like an expert witness and more like a person who'd been cornered by her own choices. Dashiell's composure cracked for the first time in a way the room could see. He glanced at Callista with a look that wasn't partnership anymore. It was accusation. Dr. Quill took the stand, raised her hand, and swore the oath with a trembling voice. I approached carefully. I didn't want to bully her. I wanted the court to see the difference between pressure and truth. Dr. Quill, I asked you treated me after the loss of my child. Correct, yes, she said, barely audible. And you signed a statement submitted to this court that described me as suffering from severe paranoid ideation. She swallowed. Yes. Is that statement accurate? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her eyes flicked to Callista for half a second, then to the judge, then down to her own hands. No, she said. Judge Pike leaned forward. Doctor, he said, speak clearly. Dr. Quill's voice rose with a sudden burst of fear. No, it's not accurate. He had depression, grief, insomnia. He was not delusional. He was not paranoid in the way that statement implies. The courtroom exhaled all at once, like everyone had been holding their breath for permission to react. Why did you sign it? I asked. Her hands shook harder. Because I was pressured, she said. Then she shut her eyes like she couldn't believe she was doing it. And because I accepted help. I shouldn't have accepted. Judge Pike's voice went flat. Define help. Dr. Quill opened her eyes and looked straight at the bench. A debt was handled, she said. A financial problem that could have ruined me. I was told what language to use, what diagnosis would be useful. Dashiell shot to his feet. Your Honor, we object. This witness is not credible. This is Judge Pike, snapped. Sit down. Then quieter but far more threatening, he added, the only credibility issue I'm seeing right now is the one forming around your client. Dr. Quill's shoulders sagged like a weight had finally been set down. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry. Judge Pike stared at Callista long enough to make the entire defense table shrink. Ms. Hallow, he said, this court is now dealing with allegations of concealed assets, coercive threats, and medical interference. Those are not minor issues. Those are not family drama. Those are the kinds of actions that turn civil proceedings into something else. Dashiell didn't look like a man preparing to win anymore. He looked like a man trying to keep his own hands clean. And as the judge ordered Dr. Quill to remain available for further questioning and potential referral, I felt the axis of the room shift. Callista had always controlled the story. She controlled what people saw, what they believed, what they repeated. Now the story was playing itself in her own voice on the record. The only thing left for her to do was react. And reaction, I'd learned, was where she made mistakes. The next phase moved faster than I expected because once a courtroom smells smoke, it stops asking whether there's a fire. Dashiell tried to slow it down anyway. He stood and requested a recess to evaluate potential criminal exposure and to protect his client's rights. He dressed it up in polished language, but it was still what it sounded like. He wanted time to regroup, to patch holes, to decide whether he was still willing to stand next to Callista at all. Judge Pike didn't even blink. Denied, he said. This hearing is in progress. If your client wishes to invoke constitutional protections in response to questions that may be incriminating, she may do so. But I will not pause a civil proceeding because the facts are becoming inconvenient. Dashiell's mouth tightened. He pivoted back to his old playbook because it was all he had left. Your Honor, even if we assume arguendo there were transfers, corporate funds move for operational reasons. Consulting fees, expansion vendor contracts, these are normal. Mr. Rourke is interpreting corporate activity through the lens of personal resentment. The existence of a trust, if any, does not automatically mean it is marital. He tried to turn my evidence back into jargon, hoping complexity would soothe the court into uncertainty. So I changed the ground beneath his feet. Your Honor, I said I'd like to address something that is not a matter of interpretation. It's math. Judge Pike's eyes stayed on me. Go ahead. I walked to my table and picked up the documents I'd prepared for this exact moment, the ones Callista's side hadn't bothered to anticipate because they were too focused on making me look unstable. This company has thousands of workers, I said. Drivers, dispatchers, warehouse staff. Many of them contribute to the company 401k plan through payroll deductions. Dashiell tried to object. Relevance. It's relevant if the marital estate includes corporate equity that was increased through illegal diversion of employee funds, I said, then looked to the judge. And it's relevant if the court is considering emergency control to protect assets. Judge Pike nodded once. Proceed. I didn't talk in big paragraphs. I walked the court through it like a checklist. This chart compares the amount withheld from employee paychecks each month to the amount actually deposited into the custodial retirement account, I said. January, February, March down the line. I placed the first page on the projector. Rows of numbers lit up the screen each month, a line item, each line item a subtraction. These are the payroll reports, I said. These are the supposed retirement deposits. And these are the bank confirmations for what was actually received. The gap was visible even to people who hated numbers. Then I placed the next page. And these, I said, are the transfers that occurred within 24 hours of those payroll deductions. Same dates, same amounts, different destination. Judge Pike leaned forward. Where is the destination? I didn't dramatize it. I just said it. An account outside the country linked to a holding structure that does not appear in the disclosures. The timing aligns too perfectly to be coincidence. It's not a bookkeeping error. It's a system. Dashiell's face changed. He stopped looking like a shark and started looking like a man standing on thin ice. Your Honor, these are serious accusations. They're numbers, I said. And numbers don't care how expensive your suit is. I expanded the context because I wanted the court to feel the human cost without turning it into melodrama. Hollow Freight runs major operations out of Macon and routes through Savannah, I said. That's thousands of people whose retirement depends on those deposits being real. If the custodial account was shorted, those workers are the ones who pay the price. Judge Pike's voice dropped. Do you have any corroboration that this wasn't a clerical issue? Yes, I said. An internal audit flagged inconsistencies last year. The auditor who questioned it was removed. His position was eliminated. The pattern continued afterward. Dashiell opened his mouth, then shut it. Because if he denied it, he'd be denying a trail that could be traced in 2 phone calls. Callista finally snapped. The calm she'd worn like armor cracked straight down the middle. He stole that, she blurted, voice high. He hacked my systems. That's what this is. He's a thief. Judge Pike's head turned toward her slowly. Ms. Hallow, he warned you have been instructed not to speak out of turn. Callista ignored him, eyes locked on me. You broke into my data. You're trying to destroy me because you can't stand that you're nothing without me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't trade insults. I kept it short because the truth didn't need decoration. I didn't hack anything I said. I didn't bypass company security. I didn't crack passwords. Callista scoffed. Then how did you get it? I looked at Judge Pike and answered like I was explaining the weather. Ms. Hallow linked her devices to our home system years ago. A family sync. Automatic backups, documents, spreadsheets, receipts. She wanted everything accessible from anywhere. Her tablet, her phone, her laptop. The files didn't live only at the office. They copied to a server in our house. The room went quiet in a new way. Not shocked, not amused, just aware. Judge Pike narrowed his eyes. Are you telling this court that corporate financial documents were being stored on a home server accessible to both spouses? Yes, I said. It was our system, installed in our basement, for family storage. She used it for convenience. She never separated it. Dashiell shifted in his seat like he just realized the illegal intrusion story he was building had a fatal hole. He leaned toward Callista and hissed something under his breath I couldn't hear, but I could see the message in his face stop talking. Callista did the opposite. That doesn't mean he had the right. That's enough, Judge Pike snapped. Ms. Hallow, you will remain silent unless addressed. Mr. Crow, control your client. Dashiell stood, but his tone had changed. He was no longer attacking me with relish. He was managing damage. Your Honor, he said carefully, given the allegations being made and the potential overlap with criminal matters, we request that the court limit further testimony to prevent prejudice and to preserve. Judge Pike cut him off. You don't get to rewrite the record because it's ugly. Then the judge said the words that made the whole room understand where this was going. Ms. Hallow may choose to remain silent on any question that may expose her to criminal liability, he said. But in this civil context, that silence carries consequences. If she refuses to answer, the court may draw adverse inferences in determining the allocation and control of marital assets. Dashiell froze. Callista stared at the bench like she couldn't believe the rules applied to her. Judge Pike continued, voice steady and merciless. If Ms. Hallow speaks, her statements become part of the record. If she stays silent, she risks losing control over the estate and the company interests at issue. Those are the choices. I felt the ground shift beneath the defense table because, for the first time, Callista couldn't buy her way out of the moment. Money can hire attorneys. It can polish reputations. It can bury stories. But it can't erase a judge's options once the facts are on paper. I stood and made my request as cleanly as possible. Your Honor, I said, I'm asking for temporary control over the voting interests and related assets within the marital estate. Not as a punishment, as a safeguard. The company is destabilizing, employees are at risk, and assets appear to be moving. The court needs a mechanism to prevent further dissipation and to protect the retirement funds that were supposed to be untouchable. Dashiell didn't argue like before. He hesitated, like he was weighing whether defending her was now defending himself into a corner. Callista's eyes burned into me. She looked furious, but beneath the fury was something else. Calculation. The kind of calculation that only shows up when someone is thinking about exits. I didn't hand the court every piece of what I had. Not yet. There was one more item in my folder that could change the urgency from serious to immediate, and I kept it where it was. Because I could feel the moment approaching when Callista would try to run figuratively or literally, and I wanted that proof to land when it couldn't be softened. Judge Pike leaned back, looking over the courtroom like he was measuring the weight of what would happen next. We will continue, he said, and we will do so carefully. I sat down, my legal pad untouched, my pulse steady. The defense side wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't even arguing with confidence. They were trying to survive the record. And as the court moved toward its next phase, I kept my hand on the thin folder in my briefcase, the one I hadn't opened yet. Because I knew something the room didn't fully understand. This wasn't only about what Callista had done. It was about what she was about to do. When I walked into courtroom 5E that morning, the room no longer saw me as the man who couldn't afford a lawyer. They saw me as a variable they hadn't been able to control. Conversations stopped when I passed. Even the bailiff gave me a look that wasn't pity or amusement, but caution. Power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as silence. Callista entered a minute later, rigid, her posture held together by will alone. Dark circles clung to her eyes, the kind no makeup can fully hide. She hadn't slept. Dashiell Crow followed her, but the distance between them had grown. He no longer looked at her like a winning client. He looked at her like unexploded ordnance. Judge Orson Pike took the bench and got straight to it. This hearing is no longer confined to ordinary marital asset division, he said. Based on the record, today's focus will be emergency measures to preserve assets and protect third parties, including employees, from potential harm. That sentence changed everything. This was no longer about who got what after a marriage failed. This was about containment. I stood and spoke before anyone could try to narrow the frame. I didn't dramatize. I organized. Your Honor, I said, the record now reflects a pattern. An undisclosed trust. Repeated transfers beyond jurisdiction. Dual internal accounting. A shell entity under the name of Ms. Kitt. A medical affidavit obtained through improper influence. And payroll deductions that do not arrive where employees were told they would. I paused long enough for the words to settle. Under a civil standard, the court does not need certainty beyond all doubt. It needs sufficient grounds to act to prevent harm. Judge Pike nodded. What relief are you seeking, Mr. Rourke? I am not asking for half, I said. Callista's head snapped up. I am asking for temporary control of the voting interests associated with the marital estate, not as a reward, as a safeguard. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. If the company remains under Ms. Hallow's operational control, I continued, there is a clear incentive to move assets quickly and leave liabilities behind. That risk does not just affect me. It affects employees, pension holders, and counterparties. Judge Pike's gaze sharpened. You're asking this court to believe she will flee. I'm asking the court to consider that risk as real, not hypothetical, I said, and I can support that. That was the moment. I reached into my briefcase and placed one more document on the table. Exhibit, I said evenly. An international flight reservation departing Atlanta tonight, booked during the recess of the previous session. Callista surged to her feet. That's a lie. Judge Pike raised a hand, but she was already talking. That's fabricated. He made it up. I didn't argue. I explained. The booking confirmation appears in the synchronized data stream tied to Ms. Hallow's devices, I said. The timestamp places it during the break. The payment method matches accounts already referenced. Callista shook her head violently. You don't even know which app she stopped mid-sentence. The room caught it. The clerk caught it. Judge Pike caught it. He leaned forward slowly. Ms. Hallow, he said, voice calm and lethal. You have just volunteered a detail that corroborates access. Sit down. Dashiell grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back, but she jerked away. Breath coming fast, control slipping. This is insane, she shouted. He's manipulating all of you. Judge Pike didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Based on the evidence presented, he said this court finds sufficient indication of flight risk and asset dissipation. Ms. Hallow is ordered to surrender her passport immediately. She is restricted from leaving the state. Certain asset categories are hereby frozen pending appointment of a receiver. Callista stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Furthermore, Judge Pike continued, this court will seriously consider transferring temporary voting control of relevant interests to Mr. Rourke should additional findings support that measure. Callista opened her mouth to protest again. She never got the chance. The courtroom doors opened not gently but with purpose. A group of men and women in dark jackets stepped in, badges visible. The lead agent spoke clearly. Callista Hallow. She said, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with securities fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and interference with medical records to manipulate legal proceedings. The sound that left Callista wasn't a scream. It was emptiness, like air leaving a punctured tire. Dashiell stepped back instantly, hands raised, already shifting roles. I request immediate access to transcripts, he said. Statements made today are now evidentiary. Agents moved in. Handcuffs clicked. Callista didn't fight. She didn't beg. She simply stared ahead, eyes unfocused, as if she'd just realized the game had ended several moves ago. I watched without satisfaction, without joy, just clarity. When the room finally settled, Judge Pike motioned me forward. Mr. Rourke, he said quietly, the market will react fast. The company may not survive the day without intervention. I am issuing an emergency order to prevent the board from liquidating assets to conceal exposure. He held my gaze. This does not end here. I know, I said. As I left the courtroom, I understood something fully for the first time. Winning inside a courtroom is one thing. Holding the line afterward is something else entirely. The order came through less than an hour later. Temporary authority over the voting interests tied to the marital estate paired with a court-appointed receiver. Oversight. Accountability. No room for improvisation. Power. I learned quickly is not a throne. It's a chair that's always on fire. Hallow Freight Systems' Midtown headquarters looked like a pressure cooker about to rupture. Employees clustered around screens. Phones rang without pause. The stock ticker bled red. Credit partners demanded reassurances no one had prepared to give. I walked into the boardroom carrying nothing but a thin folder and the court order. Conversations died mid-sentence. Who authorized this, one of them demanded. I placed the order on the table. The court did. They didn't like that answer. They talked about liquidity, about selling divisions, about cutting loose anything that might attract scrutiny. I listened, then spoke plainly. "You're not saving the company," I said. "You're trying to outrun it." That earned me stares full of contempt. So I opened the folder. Emails, approvals, transaction chains, evidence of kickbacks and pre-scandal stock moves. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out options. "You can resign and cooperate," I said. "Or I can forward this to the task force currently imaging your servers." No one argued after that. My first public move was simple. I announced that restoring the employee retirement fund was the top priority. Independent audit. Full transparency. I called union reps myself. I spoke to operations leads in Macon and Savannah. I told them the truth, things were bad, but their pensions would not be used as collateral for someone else's escape. That decision changed the atmosphere overnight. Support spread faster than fear ever had. Late that night, alone in what used to be Callista's office, I found the final piece. A safe hidden behind a painting, inside hard drives, a ledger, and notes that reached back before the marriage. My name wasn't written with affection. It was written like a target. My family's land by the Chattahoochee, a plan to acquire it through marriage, development projections. The truth didn't make me angry. It made everything make sense. I didn't confront anyone. I followed procedure. I secured the evidence, contacted the receiver, and looped in federal investigators. Truth doesn't need theatrics when it finally has the right audience. Months later, the company stabilized under oversight. The pension fund was restored. Investigations continued. Accountability followed. I went back to the beginning, to the quiet place where my family's name was etched in stone. I placed a copy of the court order there. Proof that something taken under false pretenses had been protected at last. On my first day in that courtroom, they laughed because I was poor, because I was alone, because they believed silence meant weakness. They were wrong. Silence is only weakness when the truth has nowhere to go. When everything finally went quiet, when the courtrooms emptied and the headlines moved on to the next scandal, I found myself sitting alone with a feeling I hadn't expected. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was weight. The kind that settles in your chest when you realize survival has a cost, even when you win. I kept replaying that first day in court, the laughter, the assumptions, the way my existence had been reduced to a balance sheet and a sneer. For a long time, that memory burned. Now it felt distant, like a scar you only notice when the weather changes. What stayed with me wasn't the humiliation, but the clarity that followed it. I learned that power rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as confidence, as professionalism, as inevitability. And when people believe that disguise long enough, they stop questioning it. I had been one of them once. I thought keeping my head down was dignity. I thought silence was safety. I was wrong. Silence only protects the people already holding the microphone. Standing up didn't make me fearless. It made me visible. And visibility is terrifying when you've been taught that being seen is a liability. There were nights after it all ended when I sat awake listening to the city outside my window, wondering how many others were still trapped inside stories written by someone else. People told me I was strong. I didn't feel strong. I felt stubborn. I felt tired. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in years, grounded. I had spoken the truth out loud in a room designed to intimidate me, and the world hadn't ended. Instead, it rearranged itself. Justice didn't arrive as thunder. It arrived as process, as documentation, as people finally being forced to listen. And that changed how I see fairness. It isn't dramatic most of the time. It's procedural. It's patient. It waits for someone to refuse to sit down. If there's one thing I carry forward, it's this: being underestimated is not a weakness unless you accept the verdict. The moment you decide your voice has value, even when it shakes, the math changes. Not instantly, not easily, but permanently. I didn't walk away richer in the way people imagine. I walked away intact. And that I've learned is the rarest outcome of all. I don't tell this story because I believe everyone will win the way I did. That would be a lie. Systems don't bend easily, and they don't bend for everyone. I tell it because I learned that dignity isn't granted by courts, money, or public opinion. It's claimed in the moment you refuse to let someone else define your worth. I still live simply. I still flinch sometimes when a door closes too hard or a room goes quiet. But I trust myself now in a way I never did before. I know what it costs to speak, and I know what it costs not to. If anyone takes anything from this, I hope it's that your voice matters long before anyone agrees with you. And sometimes the most important victory isn't changing the outcome. It's changing who you are willing to be when everything is on the line. Before I end this chapter, I want to pause, not to explain, not to justify, but to ask, how did this story make you feel? Was there a moment that stayed with you longer than the rest? A line that felt uncomfortably familiar? Or a silence that said more than the words ever could? Stories like this aren't really about contracts, titles, or power plays. They're about the quiet pressure people carry when they're expected to hold everything together without being seen. If you've ever been the one fixing problems in the dark, if you've ever felt both essential and invisible at the same time, I'd really like to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what part resonated or simply where you're listening from. Knowing someone is there changes the weight of telling a story like this more than you might think. And if this journey meant something to you, consider subscribing, not because you have to, but because there are more stories ahead that speak to this space between strength and silence, between logic and emotion. Thank you for listening. It matters more than you know.